Hello and welcome to the Cornerstone Fund's webinar on use of space. My name is Maria Coyne and I am the President and CEO of the Cornerstone Fund, where our mission is joining together in faith to invest in and build community. Every day we're talking with churches and other faith-based organizations who are wrestling with increased expenses and decreased revenues, and also looking for ways to increase their missional impact. Well, that's what we're here to talk to you about today. I'd like to now turn the program over to Janine Caloza, Cornerstone Fund's Chief Lending Officer.
Thanks, Maria. Good afternoon, everyone. I found this excerpt from faithandleadership.com, and I want to read a little bit as I thought it was very appropriate for our webinar today. Many of us cannot imagine our lives without our houses of worship. Not only do they provide spiritual grounding, inspiration, and camaraderie, but they also offer low-rent homes to many of our community social services, food pantries, clothing closets, child care centers, and self-help groups. A major challenge many houses of worship face is a mismatch between a big, expensive building and a small, financially stretched congregation. A congregation of a few dozen may own 10,000 or 100,000 square feet of property, use only a portion of it a couple of days a week, and hemorrhage money by trying to keep the property going. Some houses of worship are trying to stay alive by better using their overabundant or oversized or over-costly properties. Some have leased out portions of their building to other congregations, community organizations, or businesses. Others have sold their real estate and downsized, merged, or liquidated. Still others have tried to redevelop property by joint venturing with development companies or trying to become real estate developers themselves. Churches, though, often shy away from looking at innovative uses of their real estate, recalling a past when worshipers filled the pews, and they continue to anticipate a future when a small aging congregation will magically turn itself around. Or perhaps they are just feeling overwhelmed, ill-equipped to contemplate make or break real estate decisions. It's a sensitive topic, but there are steps your church can take to think in new ways about its surroundings, to view property a little more like a community asset and a little less like a standalone single-use religious building. In this webinar, Bridget Johnson, who I'll introduce in just a minute, will discuss strategies that may be helpful to your congregation. Bridget is the director of the Center for Transformational Leadership for the Southern New England Conference of the UCC, and she is highly skilled in talking about what I've just described. Bridget?
Thank you so much, Janine, and thank you, Maria. I'm just going to share my screen. So welcome everyone to Renting Your Church Facilities, the benefits, challenges, and how to get it done. Oh, I'm sorry, we just froze here, so bear with me just a moment. There we go. So why am I here speaking with you today about renting your church facilities? Well, back in November 2018, I was in a situation that may be similar to what you're in right now. At that time, I was on the board of trustees of my congregational church in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And since I was on trustees, it was very apparent that our membership was declining, and with it, our income. And I thought to myself, we need to stop focusing on cutting our expenses and hoping to increase our giving. And we need to start thinking about driving revenue and finding new sources of revenue. So I said during a congregational meeting, why don't we think about renting our facilities? Well, that great idea was met with two responses. One was blank stares, as in, you must be crazy, we don't know what you're talking about. And the other group responded in, we have never done that and we will never do that. We don't want strangers in our church. Well, enough people said, you know, I think it's worth looking into, that I volunteered and said, let's look into the feasibility of this. So we started creating a rental task force. As soon as I raised my hand and said, I'll look into it, It was amazing how many people wanted to get involved. I didn't have to ask for one volunteer. People stepped up and said, we like this idea. Let's do it. It took us 7 months to put a strategy in place. And during that time, we did our due diligence. We put together a business plan. We overcame opposition. And in June, we started driving revenue. It was so successful that other churches started asking me to help them put a strategy in place. And so I founded Church Rental Services, which was a consultancy. And I was helping other churches create and implement a strategy to do just this. In January of last year, I joined the Southern New England Conference, and so I am no longer offering my services as a consultant. But I thank the Cornerstone Fund for inviting me today, because this is an issue that is bubbling up all over our country and throughout all of our congregations and through all of our conferences. So I'm happy to share with you today what I learned through my consultancy. And I'd like us just to take a moment to step back and approach this with the thought of begin with what you have. And I love these two quotes. The first is from 2 Kings. And Elisha said, what have you in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. And we know what happened after that. And in Matthew, they said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. So I want you to start to think about this and approach this from the point of view of not what you lack, but what you have. And let's start with that. You're here probably because you recognize there are lots of benefits of renting your space. It's an opportunity to create sustainable, scalable income. Maybe you're here because you want greater community engagement. Maybe you recognize that maybe bringing new people into your church building that would never cross the threshold of a church before. But I'd like you to also think about fulfilling your mission. How can this building help you fulfill your mission? We are called to be fishers of men. So again, the approach I'd like us to take is not, how are we going to become financially sustainable? How are we going to increase our membership? Don't approach this as the glass is half empty. Rather, I'd like you to approach it in terms of what might happen if. What might happen if we create a new vision for our church? What might happen if we imagine new ways to use our buildings? What might happen if we increase our community engagement? So I'd like you to approach this as the glass is half full. You have a fantastic piece of property. That makes the glass half full. And I would encourage you to think about your property in terms of your mission and your vision. What's happening right now? What is your church's mission? What are your goals and vision for the future? And how does this rental initiative fit into those two things? And just to clarify, sometimes people are a little confused about what's the difference between a mission and a vision. The mission statement is, why do we exist? It's focusing on today. Why are we here and what are we doing? And it helps set those common strategic focuses for our churches. The vision statement is, where are we going and how are we going to get there? It focuses on tomorrow. And it gives meaning to what we're doing now that's going to help us achieve and fulfill that vision statement. And so when we think about using our facilities, the future is X plus Y equals Z. X is your mission statement. What are you doing now? Y, the actions you take in light of your mission statement. And Z is the final fulfillment. What's your vision going to? Think of Y, the letter Y, as your rentals. Your mission statement plus looking at renting your facilities can lead to the fulfillment of your vision. And I love this. If you haven't read John Doerauer's book, Beyond Resistance, I encourage you to do so, because John makes a point that we are here for mission. That is our business. And the question is, how are we doing with that? So I'd love for you to start thinking about your facilities, not in terms of driving income as much as how do we use that to fulfill our mission. So in this process, I've created what I call the 10 stepping stones to success. And the first 5 fall into the area of investigate, meaning look into the feasibility. Does it make sense? Doing a market analysis, creating your unique value proposition, coming up with staffing and your pricing. The second 10 focus on implementation, actually putting the plan in place, legal and tax issues, contracts, finding renters, creating your projections, and then go to market. So we're going to go through each of these individually. So the first one is feasibility. And again, you want to be thinking about what is my church's mission statement? In terms of feasibility, the first thing I recommend is pray. Pray on this. And I love Proverbs 3 because it says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not on our own understanding. I encourage you, please don't go into this process thinking you know the answers. God has something wonderful in store for you. This could be one of the most exciting journeys in your church's life. And so I encourage you to see what the Holy Spirit has in mind for your facilities. So go into it with this open mind and be directed by God. The second thing is practical, and that's create a task force. This is where volunteers will step up and say, you know what, I want to look into this. I want to see, does this make sense? Bring that team together. The third is survey your congregation. We are congregational churches, and we need to get a sense of how does the congregation feel about this? Sometimes you may have 1 or 2 church leaders who oppose the idea and are very vocal. But when we do a survey, we may find the congregation is very enthusiastic about this. So I'm a big believer in surveys. Let's get a sense of how the entire congregation feels about it. The fourth is we have to consider the condition of our facility, and we'll talk about that. The five and 6 sort of are together, other church challenges and priorities. If we're in the middle of a search for a settled pastor, this may not be the best time to undertake this type of journey. If we need to invest millions of dollars in a roof, this may not be the best time. So we want to think in terms of what else is happening in the life of our church. In terms of feasibility, I call this considerations, but you can also consider it objections. These are the objections you're going to hear from people that say, oh, we don't do this. Things we need to consider is it going to be a strain on the staff? Are we going to let people use our kitchen? Are we talking about renting the sanctuary, the classrooms, or both? What about our AV? Are we going to let people use our large screen TVs? Do you have an alcohol policy? That's going to impact who you rent to. Who's going to keep watch? How do we know they're not going to damage our property? Liability insurance, can we be sued? And nomenclature. I'm going to talk about nomenclature in a little bit because this is a very important point in terms of what do we call the building. The second step is market analysis. So the first thing we really want to do in market analysis is find out who else is renting their space. So we first want to look at other local faith communities. Talk to the local synagogue. Ask the Catholic Church down the street. What are the other churches doing? Are they renting their space? If so, to whom? And also, how much? How much are they renting it for? You also want to look at other local organizations that rent their space. These ultimately can become strategic partners. And this is a very important point. We're going to talk about strategic partnerships in a moment. So rather than approach them in terms of their competitors, think of them as partners. So for example, in my town, I approach the library. We have museums that rent their space, and we have clubs like the Boys and Girls Club and the Recreation Center. They're all renting their space, but I approach them as potential partners, not as competitors. Find out what kind of space they have available. What are they charging? It's amazing what people will tell you if you just ask the question, what are you charging for that space? And do not compare yourself to a restaurant or a catering hall. Often churches say, oh, my fellowship hall is the thing we want to rent and this and that. And they start thinking themselves as a place where they're having large events and so on. You're not a restaurant and you're not a catering hall. So don't worry about those. The next step is number 3 is creating a unique value proposition. And what that means is what makes your facility special in light of all those other facilities in the market that you just looked at. Number 1 is probably location. Let's face it, our congregational churches are in great locations. They're usually right in the center of town or right at a major crossroads. Architecturally, they're beautiful structures, so people can easily find the white church on the corner or the brick church in the middle of the green and so on. Location, location, location. Number 2 is the variety and number of rooms that you have. Do you have a large space plus smaller spaces? We had an opportunity, we rent our space to a youth orchestra that wanted a number of smaller rooms so that the violins could practice in the section that's different from another group. And yet we had the large space where they could all come together and perform. So you want to get a handle on the variety of space you have. Availability. Most of our buildings are empty 6 days a week. Having a building available on a Saturday could be a major opportunity for you, or after school, or in the evening. So think about what's the availability of your building. We ended up renting our building in our classrooms often in the evening for adult education classes, therapy classes, and so on. They wanted small, intimate classrooms in the evening. Furnishings. Do you have one room that can serve as a boardroom for board meetings because it's a large table with 20 chairs around it? Do you have another space that might be more intimate for a therapy session with a sofa? Ambiance. Most of our buildings are lit with very bright lighting. You can change that. I had a renter come to me one time and she wanted to do a divorce group, but the lighting was a bit much. So we ran out, we bought a $30 floor lamp, and voila, the ambiance changed completely. And during her sessions, it became a warm and inviting, safe place for her meetings. Parking. Most towns, parking is a premium, particularly if you're in the middle of town. You can monetize that. Don't feel that just because your location is in the middle of the town, everybody can use your parking. You can think about who would find value, whose business could expand because they have your parking available. You might want to think about employing a shuttle that gets people from your parking lot to that restaurant across town that needs parking. You want to think creatively. If you're thinking of renting your sanctuary to other weddings, which is something we started to do in the past, we only would have members use our sanctuary for weddings. We changed that policy. So we started renting it to New Yorkers who wanted to come and get married in Connecticut. But we needed a bride's room. So we took our library and we did a little presto changeo so that on wedding days, the bride would be able to use that as a bride's room. A performance space. You've probably heard about congregations that are taking the pews out and putting in movable seating. All of a sudden, what had been a sanctuary with pews becomes a potential performance space. Outdoor space. During this pandemic, we all know how valuable it was to be able to meet outdoors. This also goes back to the variety of rooms. A big opportunity during the pandemic has been to rent your larger room to organizations that had been meeting in smaller spaces. Take your larger room and offer to those groups that are smaller but need to be socially distanced. And your kitchen. Do you want to rent your kitchen? We decided we would only use it for what's called catering, which is heat and serve. We did not permit people to use it for cooking pancakes and everything else. So kitchen is a big consideration. The fourth step is figuring out your staffing. Usually the congregations think, oh my gosh, we are so short-staffed, we cannot take on one more thing, let alone renting our facility, forget it. Well, you know what? You can. Because what I would suggest you do is think about putting together a staff that's paid by the hour and comes out of the rental revenue. And I'm not talking about commission. I'm saying, for example, there are three key positions in this. The first is the rental coordinator. The rental coordinator is someone who does outreach and sales. And I focus on sales because this requires a sales way of thinking. It's very important that this person is able to ask open-ended questions of potential renters, be able to listen carefully to what that potential renter is saying, think creatively. It's not a marketing job, it's a sales job. So you need a rental coordinator who thinks like a salesperson. This person also responds to inquiries that come in, so that whomever is the receptionist at your church or the administrator doesn't have to respond to every single inquiry that comes in about your space. That's the rental coordinator's job. And the third thing is to execute the contracts. So this takes the burden off your church administration and delegates it to a person who is responsible just for this. They don't have 5 other roles within the church. This is the role. The second person is your event supervisor. You want someone on the premises if there's a big event going on, and this person needs to be paid. We all love our volunteers, but we know what happens on those days when all of a sudden the volunteer has to take their granddaughter to gymnastics. There's no event supervisor. This is a position that needs to be paid, and the cost of this person is built into the rental fee. The third is the question of the facilities team. How much more can our facilities team do? Well, as your rentals ramp up, you may want to consider hiring outside resources to address this need. So as we began to rent more and more of our space to events, I lined up 2 outside cleaning services that I would hire to come in and clean the bathrooms, vacuum the rug, and so on in between these events. Again, that cost was built into the cost of renting the space. So it took the burden off of our facilities team and built it into this business. The point I want to make is you need to approach this as a business. This is not a fellowship. This is not an activity that is based on having people step up as volunteers. If you really want this to work, you have to approach it as a business. The accounting is something perhaps your team could already handle, but you might want to look into some of the systems that are available now that do your credit card processing and billing in one step. The last is also key, approval process. Who reports to whom? This has to be clearly defined before you can get this started. Does the rental coordinator report to trustees? Does the rental coordinator report to the senior pastor? You have to have this line of command. The event supervisor should report to the rental coordinator, but you must have this clearly defined and in writing who reports to whom. The fifth thing is pricing. Now you've already done your homework, so you put together a worksheet that shows what your space is, capacities, both standing and seated, as well as your furnishings. Now you start to have a sense of what you have to offer and how it compares to those other facilities that you had been looking at and how much they're charging. You're starting to get a sense of what your market rate should be. You incorporate into that your staffing costs. How much is it going to cost to have that event supervisor at the event? Sanctuary versus classroom. Are you renting your sanctuary, just the classrooms, or both? Members versus non-members. This is a very important question. Often churches will let members use their space for free. Is that going to change? Or is that policy going to stay in place? We eventually changed it so that we came up with a rate, and members got 50% off the rate. So if a member wanted to rent the fellowship hall for their 50th wedding anniversary, we'd be happy to have them there. 50% off the rate to rent the hall. And we got no pushback on that. Is there a nonprofit rate? This is something that often trips up churches. Oh, well, if it's a nonprofit, they should be able to use it. What I finally realized is that if a nonprofit is using our space and they're charging other people for their meeting, for their classes, then I'm not concerned about if they're a 501c3. They're a business that's using our space to help drive their business. So in that case, there was no nonprofit rate. If it's an organization like AA or something like that where they don't charge their members, that's different. But if it's a nonprofit organization that's using our space to offer music lessons to people who have to pay for those music lessons, well, that to me is a business that happens to be a nonprofit status, in which case they pay the market rate. Are there other fees you want to build into this? We added a fee if you wanted to use our large screen monitors. We added a fee if you wanted to use the kitchen to make coffee. So you can add in these other fees into this so that people can really put together the pricing that they need. So we went through the first 5 stepping stones: feasibility, market analysis, your unique value proposition, staffing, and pricing. You've done all your homework. You've approached this as a business. You've done your due diligence. Now you're ready to implement. You've gotten the vote to move forward. So now you're good to go. So how do we get started? The first thing, and this is something that often comes up, are legal and tax issues. Whenever you hear someone say, well, we've always been told we can't do that, or it's my understanding that because we're a nonprofit, or I've heard that, anybody who says that, a bell should go off and you say, we need to consult an expert. I am not an expert. I'm not a legal expert or a tax expert, but there are experts out there, and that's who you need to go to. So consult an expert. And this is 3 criteria. Number 1, an expert in nonprofits. You don't want someone who does taxes during tax season. That's not an expert in churches and nonprofits. Number 2, it cannot be a church member. There cannot be any perceived conflict of interest. So it needs to be someone outside of the church. And the third thing is it should be a real service where you pay for it and get it in writing. You want to be able to point to this expert's advice and say, this is why we're doing it this way, and this is what we have. It's a document that lives with the church long into the future. There are a couple things that are some resources that you can do, and I consider these doing your homework before you consult the expert. So when there are questions about the nonprofit status, the IRS has a publication, Tax Exempt Status for Your Organization. This is free, online. Anybody can get it and you can read it. And it gives you a basis for what questions you should be asking. Again, don't assume. Don't think that just because in the past someone has said. It's best to do your homework. Number 2 is income tax. And these are good publications. Again, Tax Guide for Churches and Religious Organizations, Tax on Unrelated Business Income. This is key. If you start renting your space, does that become unrelated business income? The IRS has a publication on that. I would also encourage you to look at Richard Hammer's book, Church and Clergy Tax Guide. This is a Bible of the business, and it has some great guidance. But again, once you've done your homework, consult that expert. The last area people ask about legal and tax issues is property tax. Well, every town is different, and your property tax depends on your local taxing authority. That's not an IRS issue. It's a local issue. Whether your tenant is responsible, you can make your tenant responsible for real estate taxes if your real estate taxes go up. But that's something you negotiate with the tenant, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit tenant. Sometimes that really doesn't matter. Again, consult an expert about this. Bridget Johnson is not the tax expert, so please get an expert. Liability insurance. Hopefully your church has liability insurance. I insisted that every renter also has liability insurance. You want every renter who walks through your door to have liability insurance. If it's not a regular ongoing business, they can get this liability insurance as a one-time basis through their homeowner's insurance. Liability insurance is not expensive, but it's darn expensive if they get sued or your church gets sued. They must have liability insurance. Advertising. This is a tricky one. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but advertising, if you start competing with other businesses in your town by advertising, then that could impact your tax status. You don't want to become something other than a church. You don't want to become a catering hall and you're competing with the other catering hall. So you need to be very careful about how much advertising you do. We did absolutely no advertising. We did networking. Networking is so much more powerful than advertising. I would advise you, don't even think about advertising. Just get out there and network. But again, consult an expert. The seventh thing is your contracts. What kind of contracts do you need? Well, they're different things. Some are for just general usage, which is a simple contract because they want to use one of your classrooms for a meeting every week of a group. We had a young woman use one of our classrooms for art therapy for high schoolers. That's a pretty simple contract. Did include liability insurance, but it's a simple contract. Weddings, receptions, and performances are a little bit more complicated because, again, are we talking about alcohol? Are we talking about catering and music? Are we want to be sure that the caterer has the right insurance and the band has the right insurance. So sometimes some contracts are a little bit more complicated. I simply reached out to the other organizations in our town that were renting their space. They were more than happy to share with me their contracts. And from those, we drew up a general contract and then a more specific one. And we had an attorney look at it, and then we were good to go. A facility usage agreement is also sort of your invoice, and it outlines what space the renter's going to use, what's the payment schedule. This brings us to deposits. I created a situation where we want a deposit on rental. We do not rent and then hope we get paid. We insisted on a deposit on every rental we did. And the security deposit for a general rental was much less than a wedding rental, also because the numbers are different. But the point is you want that deposit also because for security reasons, if there is damage to your property, you go back to that deposit in order to cover that, that damage. We never did have any damage, but you want that deposit. Now, the next thing is finding the renters. Now, this is where the fun begins because this goes back again to your mission and your vision. And how does this renting tie into those things? So I encourage churches to not think in terms of, we want to rent our space to XYZ. Focus on the community. Ask yourself these three questions. Number one, what does God want us to do in the life of others? What are we called to do right now? That's your mission. What are you doing? What does your church want you to do? Are we located in the right place for what we want to do? Or who's here where we are located? So are we located in the right place for what we want to do? If you want to serve inner city kids and you're in the suburbs, that may not really dovetail with what the mission is. On the other hand, who is here where we're located? Looking at your community in terms of that really is your market. So when I think about community and mission focus, this is where the networking comes in. Go talk to your mayor, first selectman. Ask them, if they had more space, what would they do? Go to your social services department. Who's the head of social services? And say, you know what, we're thinking of renting our space. If we did that, could you see a need for that? They may say, oh my gosh, we've always wanted to do so-and-so, but we never had the space. Economic development. Do you have an economic development in your town? If they want to bring in small businesses, could they see the opportunity to perhaps partner with you to use your space for that? Education. Do you have a continuing education program in your town? Maybe they could use some extra space. Senior services. If your building is accessible, this could be a huge opportunity. Go talk to Parks and Recreation. Maybe they could use another space, but they don't have the money to build a gymnasium. And look at the arts and cultural organizations in your town. In Ridgefield, we have a number of arts organizations and they need rehearsal space. Well, we have just the space for you. So again, I would encourage you to not come into this in terms of thinking you know who to rent to. Reach out to your community. Let the community tell you how your space could be used. And this is the way, in my opinion, you're really going to get the renters that also meet your mission focus. This is where it gets really exciting because this is where the Holy Spirit starts really coming to action here. So the
Excuse
thing
me,
is,
Bridget,
yes,
it's Jeff. I just wanted
Okay.
to give you a 4-minute warning
okay,
so we can squeeze everything in to get through these last couple steps.
okay, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So finding renters, you don't need to spend a lot of money on marketing materials. You just need a rate sheet, a business card, which costs about $19. Nomenclature, I want to mention this. We lost rental opportunities because we called our building the quote church house. And we were playing around with the idea of changing the name of that building to something else. We do have other buildings on our campus that have names. So think very carefully about what the name of the building is that you're renting, that you want to rent. You might want to give it the name of a benefactor or something else because you may lose business because it's called church something. Types of renters, strategic partners, ongoing renters, and one-time renters. I'll go through this very quickly because this is key. Strategic partnerships, you want to approach them as an extension of their space. The library was a perfect example. They let people use their classrooms for free, but there were only a certain number of classrooms. So we partnered with them so that if someone called the library and said, do you have space available? They'd say no, but call Bridget at the Congregational Church because they do. We didn't give it away for free. We charged it, but people were thrilled to pay the fee. Your space complements their space. If you have a modern church, does it complement an antique museum? If you have an antique church, does it complement a modern building? These are partners that are going to send you leads. They are not competitors. Approach them as partners. Target market, it reflects your vision statement. Where do you want to take your church? If you want to attract young families, you might want to think about your target market and renters that would bring in young families, maybe yoga classes for moms and so forth. Kingdom partners are those that are mission aligned. Ongoing renters, retailers, go to the local bookstore. Say, have you ever wanted to do a book signing and a lecture that you can't fit in the bookstore? What about therapists, tutors, local groups, and so on? So one-time renters are pretty straightforward, christening parties. And so we partnered with the Catholic Church because they did not have any kind of rental space that they could use for parties after funerals and christenings. And so they started using our space. They rented our space for the luncheons afterwards. It worked out really well. Do your projections based on your initial research, alcohol or not, that's a key decision. And an initial investment. Do you need facility improvement? Talk to the Cornerstone Fund, staffing requirements, and marketing materials. You're ready to go to market. Put your team in place, create an action plan with goals and benchmarks. You don't want this to go on for 5 years. Start scheduling those tours and networking. Engage with your community and business leaders. This is key. The community will send you the renters. Create your elevator pitch based on your unique value proposition. Create your marketing materials, target markets, and prioritize. You can't reach everybody all the time. And that's it. So thank you very much. Do we want to handle our questions now?
Yes, Bridget, we'll just jump into Q&A.
Okay,
If
great.
anyone has a question, any attendees, please feel free to unmute. And then we also have a question waiting in the Q&A queue. So thank you.
One in the queue, Bridget, has to do with liability insurance for self-help groups. The question or comments that they can't afford it, are there other options?
Well, one option would be if it's closely aligned with the church, would the church like to include them in their liability insurance? That's one thing to consider. If it's a relationship that's been an ongoing relationship for a long time, the church might want to amend their liability insurance to include them. On the other hand, if the church doesn't want to do that and someone trips on the step going in and the church is sued, you might want to you may regret that they don't have the liability insurance to cover themselves. So there's always a way to get liability insurance, and it's not that expensive. So I think you need to be tough about that.
Richard, you want to chime in with your question?
Yes, let me see. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh, hi, good, thank you. I'm interim at a UCC church in the Boston area, and we already do considerable renting. Of course, it's slowed down since COVID, but what you've described and what we've experienced is very labor intensive. And it not only takes work hours, it takes concentration, follow through, and all these good things. Now, we have a declining congregation, very, a faithful group, very dedicated, but small. And most of them are what we call duns. You've all heard about duns, right? DONES.
Yes.
They've served 20, 30 years on committees. They're not going to be able to do the heavy lifting involved. So my question is, am I right to promote an idea that I got from partners from Sacred Places in Philadelphia, which is work with a single partner who shares the burden of the building and the administration, and perhaps even formalize that, if it's healthy and successful and goes forward over a period of time, into co-ownership of the building. How does any of that sound?
Well, Richard, first of all, thank you for joining us. And I think what I'm hearing are two different things. So let me just recap what I think I heard you say. And the first part of what your statement was that you have a congregation that is full of duns, and so they may not want to take on the extra burden of doing this kind of work and so on. And earlier in my presentation, I shared some ideas about how you pay someone to take on this responsibility, because I absolutely agree with you. To leave this to a team of volunteers is not the way I would run a business. And this is a business. If you want to take this seriously and so on, you want to pay someone who's the rental coordinator who is responsible for this, as well as the event supervisors. So that is one thing, and I'd be happy to review that with you another time again, just to what those job descriptions are. On the other hand, I think what I hear you saying is the idea of partners with this, renting it to a strategic partner and so on. I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think jumping ahead to saying that they would own the property or share the property is a big leap. I would also be cautious about putting all your eggs in one basket. One of the good things about diversifying your income stream by having a variety of different renters is that if one of them drops out of the scene, you still have a variety of other renters on the other hand. But I'd like to hear what Janine has to say about this.
I think, Richard, that's an excellent, I think it all depends on, the situation that each church is in. Prior to coming to the Cornerstone Fund, I worked with redoing a historic theater, which was used as an event space. And their idea, and it worked pretty well for a lot of the different research that I did, I would say for, say, like a wedding, right? Or, you would work with one particular vendor in terms of, if you use our space, you have to use, this person for flowers or this person for food. And so that was super helpful because oftentimes then those vendors would bring you the business, right? So it was great not having to understand all the different caterers because you were working with one specific caterer. So if they got something, they would use you as a spot. So I think it kind of runs the gamut, but it's an excellent suggestion. Again, I would agree with Bridget. I'm not sure that it goes all the way to kind of taking ownership, although we've seen that in other examples. But I think it's a great idea, particularly when, it does take some onus off of, a lot of the heavy lifting. So you have an admin person who can kind of work with that caterer, AV folks to kind of, plan the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Bridget and Janine, we have a question here in the chat from Sarah.
I saw
Think you all
that, so
can
I'm
see
going to
it. Should we
start.
charge as quote unquote
I'm sorry, go
nice
ahead.
Christians or as smart business people? We do give space to our faith partners for free. So we differentiate between partners and renters. Thoughts? Maria, Janine, Bridget.
I'm sorry, I'll start and then defer to Janine and Bridget. I saw that question about, faith partners versus renters and how much you would charge. And certainly that is a decision that that many churches have to make. The one caution I would make is that you are incurring a cost to have people in your building. You're heating the building, you're paying insurance on the building, you're doing all of those things. So it might be helpful to think of it in terms of 2 levels of rent. And I think Bridget referenced that earlier, that you might have one rate that you charge both members and people you designate as faith partners, and then another rate that you would charge to people who are purely renting.
I think also as a salesperson, I would almost approach those long-term partners and say, I don't know if you've experienced it, but our church has experienced the electricity has gone up, the oil has gone up, this and that and the other thing. And we would love to ask you if you would be willing to make a contribution to our church so that they don't become a formal renter. And it can be underscored the fact that you have a longstanding relationship with this organization. They're sort of part of your church family. However, they've probably experienced the increase in energy and everything else that we all have. And most people get that. We had to do that when we had to approach a men's group that was using our space for the last 5 million years and never paid a nickel. And as soon as we asked them to consider, it just never even occurred to them. And as soon as we made the suggestion, they were happy to make a donation. So don't be put off by that. Partners are partners, and they should respect the fact that you want to keep the lights on for them and the heat on.
We had a hand raised from Sandra. Sandra, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. We are experiencing the same issues that you've been talking about at our church, declining congregation. And we have been toying with this idea that you're talking about for quite a while and haven't really taken any firm steps. And thank you for all your suggestions. I wondered if you thought that maybe in the interest of keeping things simpler, that it might be an idea to begin with certain events, say weddings, and exclude all the other opportunities in order to get our feet wet and get some experience in what we're doing. Or should we jump in feet first and do everything?
Well, that's a great question. Sandra, I'm a feet first kind of girl, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. I kind of jump in and say, let's go for it. But I think that's a fair question. I would go back to thinking about your market analysis and figure out there may not be that many people getting married. In which case, when you say get your feet wet, you may be spending some time and energy getting your contracts in place and so on for 1 or 2 weddings. I just don't know. I would rather see you, my recommendation would be just to do a little market analysis and networking. Most of our leads came from me simply asking the question, what if? What if you had more, if the organization had more space? The point is, you don't necessarily have to make a commitment that you'll take every single potential renter that comes through the door. Just getting out into your community and networking, you may find there's tremendous opportunity to just rent those 2 classrooms that you have. You may drive more revenue by renting 2 classrooms twice a week or something than doing 1 wedding, every 6 months. So my point to you is I would encourage you to just do your homework and see where is the opportunity. It may not be in weddings. It may be something much almost simpler, smaller. Weddings can be very complicated in terms of renting.
They can
And-
be. And I'll add one more thing just to jump in, Bridget, in terms
Sure.
of like the weddings. I agree. If you're just getting like a rental fee, right, it just may not, I mean, it may be worth it, it may not. The other thing I want to kind of piggyback on is the comment I made about the caterers. When we were looking at the event space, a lot of times if you work with, limited caterers, they'll actually offer, if they've got like first right of refusal or whatever, to actually give you a percentage of like the food bill. So that, again, that may be something that you want to think about. But Bridget's right, you could do the cost benefit. Is it worth that one wedding, or is it, I've got this classroom all ready to go? Is that the one we want to go with? And kind of like a soft launch,
Yes.
right? You kind of start and you can always say no.
Great, thank you so much. I wondered if we would be getting a hard copy of the material today?
This presentation is being recorded, and so that would be available through the Cornerstone Fund.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us, Sandra.
Thank you. It's been-
Thank you, both Bridget and Janine, for your responses to that last question. Janine, we wanted to switch it to you for a couple minutes because I know you've got some other examples to share. And I think we have a couple more questions kind of waiting in queue, and we'll get to those last questions after Janine speaks.
You
Jeff,
know
I'm
what?
gonna-
I would probably just go with the questions because we've got such limited time, if that's okay. And then I can share my information with folks after. I think I'd rather keep the conversation going if people have questions that need to be answered. with
Okay.
Bridget here.
That
if
works.
that's okay.
Great. Well, we have time for 2 more questions. So I know I saw a hand raised from Reverend Carly. So go ahead.
So my congregation has been renting this building, or actually space sharing. We're not allowed to call it renting for property tax purposes. But we did a cost analysis of what does it cost us to have this space. And our prices are based upon the cost of having the building. The village will not allow us to share space for anything more than it costs. So our goal has always been, let's get 65% of the cost of the building paid for by people who share its space. We have exceeded that goal. We're actually at about 77% currently. We're located in a suburb of Chicago. My question is, we were told that it is not allowable to have a for-profit in our space. We are a wedding venue. We have about 30 weddings a year, and it actually turns out to be a fabulous process. I have a staff person whose only job is to invoice and to host those events. But the for-profits, how can a church which is nonprofit lease or rent or share space with a for-profit?
Well, I'm happy to tackle this, but again, it goes back to my slides that say consult an expert. Don't go by what people have told you in the past. But my experience, Reverend Carly, is that the IRS really doesn't care whether your income is coming from a for-profit or a nonprofit. It has more to do with whether whether your income is becoming your primary business or not. So if you're driving more money from weddings and things like that, the IRS may say, well, you're not really a church anymore, you're a wedding hall. And then that's a point where you make a decision. You may say, you know what? I'm happy to pay the IRS 10% of that revenue because I sure darn like keeping the 90%. So that's a different set of decisions you have to make at that point. But I think if you take a look at some of those IRS booklets that I recommended, and you'll be getting the presentation, you go back to those and you do your homework, the IRS doesn't really care whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit in your space. Janine, would you agree with that?
I would definitely recommend talking to a tax attorney and all of that for absolutely sure. But, I worked a lot in the nonprofit world. And again, once you're kind of income generating in certain aspects, they don't care who it's really coming from, but you're income generating. So I would definitely have a conversation with an attorney just to say at what threshold, in the church world, do you need to cross where you're considered, that's like the main, and again, I don't know the answer to that. But it's certainly worth a conversation.
On a different topic, because we have done all of this development through our attorneys and through other consultants, I am perfectly willing to share with anyone who would like them the templates of our policies and our invoices and our space sharing covenants. They're boilerplates, but I would be glad to share them.
That's
That's
great.
terrific. If you could send them to the Cornerstone Fund, we'll make sure that anybody on this webinar that wants access to them has them. That's very kind. We really appreciate that.
I just want to go back to your question, Reverend Carly, also, because I don't know what income you're looking at, but what some organizations have thought about doing, and some churches have done this, is they've created a freestanding for-profit business as a separate business from their church that then drives the profits to the church. So the money goes to the church. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Paul Newman's Own salad dressing and Newman's Own pasta sauce. But anyway, it's something here where Paul Newman founded this company, and all the profits from this for-profit business go to nonprofits. Well, some churches are being very innovative in that they're creating a for-profit business like a freestanding coffee shop that is a for-profit business. So it's not impacting the taxes of the church, but their profits are being donated back to the church. This is a little bit more elaborate in terms of a business model, but it is something that some innovative churches are doing with great success.
It's something that's done in the nonprofit world all the time in terms of like development and real estate. It's creating that separate LLC, limited liability company that kind of protects the actual nonprofit. So excellent suggestion, Bridget.
Well, thank you, Bridget and Janine and all of the participants that asked such good questions. There's one other quick question that was in the Q&A that I'm going to address as I wrap us up today. And it had to do with how do you stay aligned to your own values, whether it be around LGBTQ inclusion, whether it be around green and composting and so forth. I think that you can stay consistent to your values. Just because you do rent space doesn't mean that you have to. This has been a wonderful conversation. I just wanted to remind everybody that Cornerstone Fund is here. If you are interested in finding out more information, we have more upcoming webinars. We're going to be sending you a link to evaluate this particular webinar. It helps us improve every time we go out there. Watch for notices about new upcoming webinars. And if you have any questions about anything, financing, investing, anything related to managing your church finances, please contact us at info@cornerstonefund.org, or you can chat with us on our website at cornerstonefund.org. It was a pleasure being able to discuss this topic with everybody today. And we really appreciate your active participation and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Thanks to everyone.